The most alarming teenage houses are not always the loud ones. Sometimes, the truly unsettling house is the efficient one. No slammed doors, no dramatic rebellion, no explosive arguments about rules, politics, friends, or identity. The teenager says, okay, goes upstairs, handles the visible obligations, and keeps the emotional temperature low. Parents often feel relief when they arrive here. Finally, the chaos is over. Finally, they are maturing. Finally, our parenting is working. But there is a version of this quiet that is not maturity at all. It is emotional exit. The teenager has discovered that direct resistance is expensive, ineffective, or humiliating. So they have switched strategies. They are no longer trying to change the relationship from inside it. They are simply learning how to live around it. Adults tend to romanticize obedience because obedience is easier to manage than protest. Protest is noisy. Protest challenges authority. Protest exposes parental weak spots. Protest forces a family to confront the question of whether there is enough room in the home for another will to exist. Silence, by contrast, flatters adults. It lets them imagine harmony. Yet a teenager's silence can carry multiple meanings. It can mean thoughtfulness. It can mean healthy privacy. And it can mean something much darker. I have concluded that showing you my real mind no longer pays. That conclusion usually forms through repetition, not trauma. The teenager argues and is lectured into exhaustion. They disagree and are treated as disloyal. They open up and get corrected before they feel understood. They show emotion and trigger parental irritation or panic. Eventually, they stop placing living material where it keeps getting mishandled. One way to understand this shift is through economics rather than emotion. Teenagers are constantly making cost calculations. What does honesty cost? What does protest cost? What does asking cost? What does truth cost before I have organized it? In a healthy relationship, the cost is present but survivable. You may face limits, consequences, disagreement, frustration, but you do not lose dignity. You do not feel turned into a problem every time you expose a real part of yourself. In an unhealthy dynamic, the cost rises. Every disagreement becomes a referendum on character. Every strong feeling creates a household weather event. Every act of separateness gets interpreted as insult. At a certain point, the teenager does what any intelligent system does under high cost. They reduce exposure. This is why good behavior in adolescence needs interpretation. A compliant teenager can be secure, respectful, and connected. They can also be emotionally evacuated. The distinction lies in whether the teenager still feels free to bring friction, complexity, and difference home. Do they still have opinions that could challenge you? Do they ever risk disappointing you honestly? Do they ask for privacy without looking guilty? Do they let you see confusion before they have cleaned it up? Do they still bring the unpolished parts of their day into your presence? If not, quiet may be concealing a serious loss of relationship. Parents who rely on behavior alone miss this because behavior is the final product. The real issue is whether the self remains in the room. A major contributor to this loss is what might be called parental totalism, the habit of treating every issue as if it must become complete. The teenager says one thing, and now the parent needs the whole backstory, the entire emotional landscape, the moral lesson, the behavioral plan, the agreement, the future guarantee, the expression of gratitude, the reassurance that the relationship remains intact. For the parent, this can feel like care. For the teenager, it often feels like engulfment. Small truths become too expensive to tell because they trigger total conversation. So the teenager waits until the problem is either solved privately or impossible to hide. Parents then complain, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Very often the answer is simple, because sooner would have become too much. Another cause is the parental inability to distinguish disrespect from difference. Teenagers will use imperfect tone. They will challenge assumptions badly. They will be developmentally clumsy in how they defend their own minds. If parents treat every rough edge of individuation as personal insult, the teenager quickly learns that selfhood must either be hidden or performed elsewhere. Families that cannot metabolize difference often produce one of two outcomes: chronic conflict or strategic disappearance. The second outcome is easier on parental nerves in the short run. It is usually worse for intimacy. The teenager who has gone quiet often develops advanced forms of adaptation. They become agreeable without being open, helpful without being vulnerable, present at meals but absent in spirit. They answer direct questions accurately while withholding the texture of their life. They learn how to give parents enough information to prevent escalation without granting real access. This is not hypocrisy. It is boundary making under conditions where direct boundaries have not been respected. Some teenagers even become remarkably kind to their parents in this phase, which makes the loss harder to detect. They are kind because kindness is efficient. Kindness creates less friction than honesty. That sentence should trouble every adult who hears it. Technology and modern parenting intensify this dynamic. Many parents can now track location, monitor grades in real time, inspect devices, and maintain a degree of informational access previous generations could not have imagined. That access can create the illusion of relationship. The parent knows where the teenager is, who they are with, what assignments are missing, what time they came home, sometimes even what they typed. Yet information can increase while intimacy decreases. In fact, the more parents rely on extracted data, the less teenagers may feel the need to bring reality voluntarily. Why would they, if being known has become a system rather than a relationship? The house fills with information and empties of invitation. There is also a subtler version of emotional exit that looks like competence. The teenager becomes very responsible. They do the work, avoid obvious risks, cause minimal drama, maybe even care for the emotional climate of the family better than the adults do. This child often gets praised the most. Yet hypercompetence in adolescence can be a form of hiding. If I am easy enough, no one will look closely. If I am reliable enough, I can keep the deeper parts private. If I do not create trouble, I get to keep some territory. This is why the child who never caused any problems sometimes becomes the adult with the deepest private grief about family life. Their adaptation was misread as flourishing. What restores contact is not forcing more disclosure. Forced intimacy is just another form of control. What restores contact is altering the emotional environment so that the self no longer has to work so hard to protect itself. This begins with parents becoming less expensive to tell the truth to. Fewer speeches, fewer immediate interpretations, less woundedness in response to difference, more ability to let a conversation remain incomplete, more respect for privacy that is not clearly dangerous. More acknowledgement that some quietness in adolescence is healthy, and some is earned by parental style. The crucial shift is from extraction to invitation. Invitation sounds like, you don't have to tell me everything, but I want to be someone you can be real with. Extraction sounds like, you need to explain yourself to restore my comfort. There is also enormous value in parents learning how to recognize the old signals of life and welcome them when they return. A sarcastic opinion offered honestly. A complaint that is not well packaged. A disagreement raised without fear. A rambling story. A moment of visible confusion. These are not nuisances. They are signs that the teenager still believes some part of them can arrive unedited. If your first response is to tighten, moralize, overcorrect, or flatten the moment into instruction, the window closes again. If your response communicates, in effect, I can stay in contact with you without winning this conversation immediately, the relationship gains oxygen. Parents also need the humility to ask a question many avoid. What about me became too hard to talk to? That question is painful because it threatens the image of the caring parent. Yet adolescents are rarely shutting down for no reason. Something in the relational pattern has taught them caution. Maybe you overreact. Maybe you mock what matters to them. Maybe you share private things too freely. Maybe every problem becomes a referendum on respect. Maybe your anxiety turns into control. Maybe your disappointment fills the room so completely that they feel responsible for your recovery. None of this makes you monstrous. It makes you human and in need of correction. Teenagers can tolerate human parents. What they struggle to tolerate are parents who refuse to consider their own effect on the climate of honesty. The path back often begins not with a demand, but with a sentence of unusual adulthood. I think you learned that being real with me costs too much, and I want to change that. Few teenagers hear anything like this. It matters because it names the hidden economy. It does not ask the child to prove the case in a courtroom. It does not defensively rehearse intention. It simply acknowledges impact. From there, repair can become behavioral. You listen without cornering. You stop turning every disclosure into strategy. You hold privacy more carefully. You react proportionally. You let some conversations end before they become emotionally extractive. Slowly, the teenager may start risking the self again. This matters because the teenager who leaves the relationship from the inside often carries that pattern forward. They become an adult who is pleasant, capable, emotionally edited, and hard to reach. They may repeat the family dynamic in romance, friendship, and work. Give enough to function, hide enough to survive. That is the long-term cost of quiet disengagement. It is not just a lost season of adolescence. It is a style of intimacy built around minimization. Families can interrupt that, but not by demanding more performance from the child. They interrupt it by making contact less punishing. And if this gave you a more honest way to think about teenage quiet, subscribe. This channel is for people who want to understand the invisible shifts that shape family life long before the obvious crises appear. And send this video to one person close to you, someone with whom you want to build healthier, wiser relationships with the children in your lives. Sometimes the right intervention is not to silence the rebellion. It is to make sure the self never has to leave the room just to avoid it. Because a teenager who still argues may still believe you are reachable. The one who has become perfectly manageable may be telling you something far more disturbing. Not that they have finally learned respect, but that they no longer expect relationship to justify the cost of honesty. That is the moment parents most need to wake up. It looks quiet. It is not peace. One useful test is this. If your teenager told you tomorrow that they disagreed with a major family expectation, had made a choice that embarrassed you, or had been hiding an important part of their life, would they expect your first response to be steadiness or fallout? Their expectation matters more than your self-image. A parent may think of themselves as open-minded, while the teen has learned, through pattern, that openness ends where parental fear begins. That gap between self-image and lived impact is where disengagement often grows. It is also worth noticing how families treat unfinished thought. Teenagers rarely bring insights in polished form. They arrive awkwardly, defensively, half-formed, sometimes with bad tone and contradictory logic. If the family can only tolerate well-packaged truth, then only finished truth gets spoken. But most important truths in adolescence are not finished. They are emerging. Identity, attraction, doubt, anger, ambition, confusion, resentment, loneliness. These come out messy. A parent who can stay present to messy thought without instantly fixing or condemning it becomes one of the few adults a teenager can actually use. A parent who cannot will keep receiving only the cleaned version, if that. And remember that emotional exit is not always dramatic to reverse. Often it softens through repeated proof, not persuasive argument. You keep their confidence once. You respond proportionally twice. You let a disagreement remain open without punitive coldness. You ask about their world without turning it into surveillance. You stop performing omniscience. You become easier on the nervous system. Over time, the teenager may not even announce the change. They simply start dropping more of themselves into conversation again. That is how you know the relationship is becoming inhabitable. In that sense, the real opposite of rebellion is not obedience. It is trust. Obedience can happen in fear. Obedience can happen in numbness. Obedience can happen because the teenager has abandoned hope that the relationship can hold anything more alive. Trust is different. Trust means the teenager can keep becoming themselves and still believe the relationship has room for reality. Parents who understand this stop chasing peace at any price. They start asking for something better than peace. A household where difference does not automatically become danger, and where silence is not the main proof of success. So if the house has gotten very quiet, listen carefully. Is it the quiet of mutual respect, where both people can rest? Or the quiet of a young person economizing exposure because the cost of honesty has become too high? The answer will shape everything you do next. And if you recognize the second kind of quiet, do not waste time defending the past. Teenagers do not reopen because the parent wins the historical argument. They reopen when the future begins to feel less punishing than the past. That is the work now, becoming a place where unfinished truth can survive first contact. A place where disagreement is not a family emergency. A place where privacy is not automatic guilt. A place where a teenager does not have to choose between honesty and self-protection every time they speak. When a home becomes that kind of place, rebellion no longer has to carry the entire burden of individuality, and silence no longer has to carry the burden of survival. Then quiet can become what parents hoped it was all along. Not absence, but ease. Not disengagement, but trust.